Hello and welcome to another episode in this series that we are doing to mark India's 75 years of independence. And the series, as some of you would know, is about the wars that have been thrust upon India and how India's military in particular and India's leadership in general took the necessary steps to ensure that India's territorial sovereignty remains intact. And in this episode, we're going to talk about what led to the Sino-Indian conflict of 1962 that sowed the seeds of rivalry between India and China, which continue to exist until now. And some of the aspects that came into play then remain extremely relevant now, and therefore there is a need for us to understand the history of why India and China remain two estranged large neighbors in Asia across the Himalayan frontline. It all started actually with the Communist Party of China that came into being in 1949 after Mao Zedong and his team had finished their long march and they came back to take control of China, which was until then controlled by various communist and non-communist dispensations. But one of the things that Mao and his team did was to challenge the existing historic narrative that had come to play. They questioned the reasons that led to China having to live with a boundary with India in particular, as well as some of their other neighbors, which were not in keeping with their designs of a greater China. China saw, and Mao's China in particular, saw India as an inheritor of Britain's legacy, India as an extension of the imperial Raj of Britain, because a number of things, including the boundary, which India was standing by and insisting was the boundary between India and Tibet, and eventually as China occupied Tibet became the boundary for India between India and China, was something that the Chinese leadership was unwilling to accept. The classic examples are the McMahon line on India's northeast and what is now being called the line of actual control around East Ladakh and Aksai Chin. But before that, it is important to understand that India had received its boundary layout by the British Raj through various campaigns that were led by the British leadership along with Indian soldiers. Classically, the boundaries of Ladakh were laid out after the Treaty of Chushul in 1842, inasmuch as China saw India pretty much responsible for China's economic plight for the several decades before the British colonial influence began to fade away. Classic examples being how China's economy was shattered by the British by making the country dependent on opium, which came from India, and China eventually became from a rich country to a country of opium addicts. People were selling everything to buy opium. And China's flourishing tea trade with the world was destroyed by the British to make the tea industry in India pick up. So there were many reasons why China was hostile towards India. But most importantly, what Chinese leadership believed was a boundary arrangement that was thrust upon them. After the expeditions that took place to Tibet by Young Husband and various other columns that went there, the British leadership decided to have a conference in Shimla, which was going to spell out the boundary between India and Tibet, and later India and China. This was called the Shimla Conference between 1913 and 1914. There were more than 6 major meetings in Shimla where representatives of the fading Chinese empire were present, as well as the representatives of the Tibetan rulers, essentially the Dalai Lama and his dispensation. But the conference was largely conducted by a gentleman called Lieutenant Colonel Henry McMahon, who was a boundary maker. He'd been responsible for the creation of the Durand line, which today separates Pakistan with Afghanistan. So he was very confident in his ability to draw boundary lines. So McMahon's conference, after more than 6 meetings, was getting nowhere. So eventually Henry McMahon, in frustration, gave warnings, and Britain could at that stage give warnings because it was so powerful militarily, to the Chinese rep and the Tibetan reps to fall in line so that a boundary line could be drawn. And he one fine day pulled out a large map, which was called a quarter-inch map, in which an entire township is available in a small square like this, pulled out a big thick felt pen and drew a line roughly along the markings that his expeditions had shown along the Himalayas, which now separates Arunachal Pradesh from China and parts of Tibet. This came to be known as the McMahon line. And the McMahon line really runs from where Sikkim and Bhutan are right to India's boundary, to a tri-junction between India, Myanmar and China. So the Chinese representative reluctantly initialed it because he said he didn't have authorization to sign the map. And the Tibetan representative signed it, so it became announced that the boundary has been sorted out, and this was to be known as the McMahon line. This died in the eyes of the world because just around that time in 1914, the world went in for World War I, and there wasn't much global attention given to what was seen as a clearly regional dispute. The boundary between India and Tibet in the northern areas, which is Ladakh, was never agreed and finalized. Eventually, after the Indian and Chinese independent regimes took over their respective countries, there was a desire to address the unsettled boundary issues. So Pandit Nehru, while busy with many other challenges of independent India, decided to more or less fix the boundary, which was the boundaries of the British Empire around Tibet. And Tibet was the real focus point between China and India, because China from the north of Tibet laid claim to Tibet and the Tibetan plateau, which was rich in water resources and minerals. And India from the south just wanted the boundary to be firmed up so that there would be no disagreements and clashes. India did eventually announce a new set of maps. This was to upset the Chinese, just like the maps announced a few years ago by the current government again upset the Chinese, in which parts of Ladakh, which make up Aksai Chin, etc., were shown to be parts of India, and India still claims that based on a historical legacy, because these were the territories of Jammu Kashmir and Ladakh which the Maharaja of Kashmir laid claim to, and the Maharaja, as we know, acceded to India. The other part was the McMahon line, which the Chinese initially did not dispute. Pandit Nehru was quite happy to announce, map or no map, the McMahon line is India's boundary, which is really, if you look at the map of India, those days was the outer edge of NEFA, Northeast Frontier Agency, but now is the boundary of Arunachal Pradesh. There was another issue that came up, and that was essentially about parts of Arunachal Pradesh which Pandit Nehru and his government decided to lay claim based on a study report that was initiated under Pandit Nehru's Minister of State for Defence, a retired Major General Himmat Singh Ji. And the Himmat Singh Ji committee finally outlined what was going to be India's boundary claims along the McMahon line. These boundary claims were the basis on which India decided to settle wherever the boundary was not very clear, despite the McMahon line having had a demarcation on a map. But again, as I said, it was drawn with a very thick felt pen on a very small map. So a kilometer here and there would be anybody's area of claim. The aim was to settle all the boundary issues, and one area which today even China claims is the area in and around Tawang. There was a rather far-thinking Indian governor of the large state of Assam, which made up all the northeastern states as they are today. His name was Governor Daulat Ram, and he initiated a mission under a tough northeastern major. His name was Major Bob Thang, military cross from World War, and was asked to go and put India's flag in Tawang. Thang marched all the way to Tawang from the plains of the Himalayas, and eventually, after a lot of stops on the way, he reached Tawang and did a bayonet march in front of the population of Tawang, which was a mixed group of Tibetan monks and locals who partly had affiliation with China, partly had affiliation with Tibet, and therefore planted the Indian flag there and announced Tawang was a part of India. This is something that rankles China even till date. There was also an initiative which worried the Chinese, was about how Indian expeditions began probing and looking at Chinese deployment and development. One, through reconnaissance patrols around Aksai Chin, and there is an interesting story of Captain Rajendranath who went close to Chinese positions which had begun to build up between 1952 and 1957 around Aksai Chin. He brought a report, but his report was concealed, just as the report of another committee set up by Himmat Singh Ji was also concealed. There is a debate still out whether these were to respond to Sardar Patel's warnings to Pandit Nehru in November 1950 that China would intrude into India from the northeastern areas, or was it in response to not allowing the issue to flare up in public domain? Either way, these reports were hushed up. There was also a series of air reconnaissance patrols that were carried out in Aksai Chin and went all the way to Lhasa. At this point of time, the Chinese had become very close to the Russian regime of the communists, and Khrushchev, who was Russia's leader, initially treated Mao as a junior, but eventually announced in his visit to Peking, which is now Beijing, that the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution were the two important landmark events of history. This emboldened the Chinese, and the Russians gave the Chinese a lot of military wherewithal, including a large fleets of aircraft, essentially to counter America's military invasion of Korea to take back the Korean peninsula, which the Russians were resisting against. But in the bargain, China built up a large and formidable air force. At one time, it was said to have the largest air force in the world, at least in numbers. And all this put together, the Russians also gave China the necessary wherewithal to start a nuclear program. And therefore, China, along the Himalayas, created a nuclear program at Loknor, which is between Lhasa and Himalayas. And these photographs were picked up by air reconnaissance flights by India. One of them was done by a group captain, squadron leader who later became wing commander. His name was Jagginath, and he went many times along the Himalayas and photographed Chinese positions and interest. This made the Chinese extremely worried, because their view was that these photographs would be passed on by India to the Americans, since America and India were beginning to come close in the eyes of the Chinese. Please remember, at this time, China had taken over the Tibetan plateau and was using very tough tactics to impose its will on the people of Tibet. At the same time, the Chinese were not keen that India and America come too close, because America's military capacity to hit Chinese nuclear positions would have destroyed their ambitious program. And therefore, the tensions between India and China began to rise to the extent that the Tibetan rebellion against Chinese occupation was being supported by the CIA through various operations, paradrops, armed drops, and eventually, of course, this led to the flight of the Dalai Lama into India, and from 30th March 1959, the seeds were sown for long-term rivalry between China and India. But that, how it evolved into a conflict between the two, is the story that we'll tell in the next episode.